Sometimes, love doesn't knock on the right door. It breaks it open, walks in uninvited, and dares you to choose between your heart and your conscience. The world was a blur of white light, antiseptic air, and distant voices calling her name. Somewhere between life and death, she floated, weightless, detached, fading. She remembered the sound of the crash, the pain, the chaos, and then nothing, until she heard his voice, calm, steady, certain. It cut through the fog like a thread pulling her back. "Stay with me," he said, his tone more command than plea, and in that moment she did. Not because she was strong, but because something in his voice made her believe she could be. When her pulse faltered, his hands pressed over her chest, not just to restart her heart, but to remind it that it wasn't done beating yet. And when her eyes fluttered open days later, blurry and disoriented, the first face she saw was his, tired, lined with worry, but somehow peaceful. The man who had fought death for her stood quietly at her bedside, watching over her like a guardian who refused to rest. She didn't know who he was then, not yet. All she saw was kindness in his eyes and exhaustion written in the small creases around them. Gratitude rushed through her like a wave she couldn't contain. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but her voice cracked under the weight of emotion. He smiled softly, as if he could hear her gratitude even without words. "You're safe now," he said, in that same calm tone that had guided her back from darkness. She closed her eyes again, not from weakness, but from peace. The world, for the first time in months, felt still. She didn't know that in saving her body, he had also unknowingly awakened something far more complex, a spark she would soon struggle to silence. As she recovered, he visited often, professional, composed, but undeniably gentle. He asked how she was feeling, adjusted her medication, and always ended with, "You're healing beautifully." She began to wait for those words more than the medication itself. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something quieter, deeper, built on the gratitude of survival. He spoke to her like she was more than a patient. He remembered the smallest things, her favorite tea, the way she fidgeted with her hands when anxious, the songs she hummed under her breath when no one was around. Every small detail became a bridge between doctor and patient, between formality and something dangerously personal. And she, still fragile but alive, found herself crossing that bridge without realizing it. Then one morning, everything shifted. She was sitting up in bed, feeling stronger, when the door opened and her boyfriend walked in. His hand clutching flowers, his smile apologetic. Behind him walked the doctor, and that's when the truth hit her like a thunderbolt. Her rescuer, her savior, the man whose voice had pulled her from the edge, was his father. The world tilted again, not from illness, but from realization. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken confusion. Her boyfriend greeted his father casually, unaware of the storm that had just erupted inside her chest. The man who had held her hand through the worst pain of her life was the same man who had raised the person who had caused some of her deepest heartbreaks. It felt cruel, almost poetic, the way fate tangled hearts and histories in such impossible ways. That night, alone in her room, she couldn't stop replaying every memory. His touch, his words, his gaze. None of it had been inappropriate, yet all of it now carried a different weight. What was gratitude and what was affection? Where did the line blur between admiration and something more? She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the faint scar where his hands had saved her, and wondered if the beating she now felt was hers, or a remnant of what he'd given her. She tried to convince herself that she was confused, that it was the trauma speaking. But deep down, she knew better. Sometimes the heart recognizes something long before the mind dares to name it. From that day on, every encounter with him became a test she didn't know how to pass. His professionalism never wavered, but there were moments, small, fleeting ones, that betrayed what neither dared to admit. The way his eyes lingered a second too long, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the way he seemed to sense her unease before she even spoke. She wanted to hate herself for feeling what she felt, but how do you condemn the person who gave you your second chance at life? She told herself she owed him respect, not emotion. But love, especially the kind that sneaks up on broken souls, doesn't ask for permission. It just blooms, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully, where it shouldn't. In the weeks that followed, her recovery became more than physical. It was emotional resurrection. Every step she took down that sterile hospital hallway felt like reclaiming a life she didn't think she'd have. And every time she saw him watching from afar, she felt both gratitude and guilt weaving through her chest like twin threads of fire. She didn't know what their story would become, or if it would even be allowed to exist. All she knew was that something had changed forever the moment he said, "Stay with me." Because she had, and part of her still would, long after the monitors were turned off and the hospital doors had closed behind her. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing more than admiration, gratitude, perhaps, a natural response to someone who had literally saved her life. That's what she told herself every night as she stared at the hospital ceiling, tracing the cracks that looked like the veins of her own confusion. "He's your doctor," she whispered to herself, trying to stitch sense into her restless heart. But logic, she would learn, is powerless against feeling. Every time he walked into the room, it was as if the air shifted lighter yet heavier, calm yet charged. He carried with him a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention but earned it effortlessly. She noticed the way he listened not just to her words, but to her silences. And in those silences, something unspoken began to bloom. When she was finally discharged, she thought the feeling would fade with distance, but it didn't. If anything, it deepened. She found herself remembering the smallest things, the way his sleeves were always rolled neatly to his elbows, the warmth in his voice when he asked how she was doing, the faint scent of coffee that lingered on his coat. These were ordinary details, yet they felt sacred in her memory. She chastised herself, knowing how wrong it was. He was older, wiser, and most importantly, her boyfriend's father. The very thought of it was enough to make her stomach twist. But the heart doesn't care for titles or timelines. It only knows who made it beat differently. And he had. Against every moral fiber in her being, she couldn't stop the gentle pull that kept drawing her back toward him, like the tide returning again and again to the same shore. Weeks turned into months, and their paths crossed more often than fate should have allowed. Family dinners, brief hospital checkups, accidental encounters that felt too coincidental to be real. Each meeting was brief, polite, and painfully controlled. Yet beneath every exchange of words ran a current neither could ignore. When he looked at her, she felt seen not as someone's girlfriend, not as a patient, but as a person. He noticed the way her hands trembled when she was anxious, the way her laughter always hesitated before escaping her lips. And every time he offered comfort, it wasn't in grand gestures, it was in his restraint, his patience, his understanding. That, she realized, was what made it dangerous. It wasn't lust, it was connection. The kind that asks nothing but gives everything, and that kind of love, the quiet, forbidden kind, was the most intoxicating of all. She began to feel trapped inside her own emotions. Every attempt to bury her feelings only seemed to water their roots. She dated his son, smiled at his jokes, tried to pretend everything was fine, but every interaction was a performance she no longer believed in. The doctor's presence lingered in the back of her mind like a song she couldn't forget. And it wasn't just his presence, it was his decency. He never once crossed a line, never gave her a reason to feel guilty, and somehow that made it worse. His integrity became the mirror that reflected her confusion. The more he resisted, the more she admired him. The more she admired him, the more impossible it became to ignore what was growing between them. It was a love that wasn't supposed to exist, yet it thrived in silence, feeding on restraint and longing. There were moments, small, fleeting, fragile, where their emotions almost broke free. A shared glance that lasted a heartbeat too long, a brush of hands as he handed her a file, a moment of laughter that felt like a secret shared. Each one left a mark, invisible yet indelible. It wasn't the kind of passion that burned fast. It was the kind that simmered quietly, steadily, waiting. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't decode, something between affection and regret. And in those moments, her chest ached with the weight of what could never be. The world around them went on, people talked, laughed, lived, but between the two of them existed a fragile universe held together by what they could not say. Inside that silence, she learned the most painful truth. Forbidden love doesn't die from lack of feeling, it dies from too much of it. It consumes you from the inside, burning without smoke, screaming without sound. She would lie awake at night, torn between loyalty and desire, between the life she had and the one she imagined. Every part of her knew it was wrong, yet every heartbeat betrayed her. The forbidden emotion had become her shadow, always near, always following, always reminding her of the man who had saved her once, but might just destroy her now. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a truth she couldn't escape. And the cruelest part of it all was knowing deep down that he felt it too. Secrets, they say, are heavier than truth, and hers felt like carrying a storm inside a fragile glass heart. Every day that passed, the weight grew harder to bear. She lived between two worlds, one built on duty and the other built on desire. To everyone around her, life had returned to normal. She was recovering, smiling, moving forward. Her boyfriend thought she was finally healing, but what he didn't know was that the very man who had saved her body was the same one holding her heart hostage. Every dinner, every family gathering, every shared laugh came laced with silent agony. The truth sat like a ghost between them, unseen but ever present, watching, waiting for the moment it would finally be spoken aloud. But she couldn't, because speaking it would shatter everything, not just her life, but theirs too. Each time she walked into that house, she could feel his presence before she saw him. The air shifted heavier, warmer, charged with something she couldn't name. He would greet her politely, voice steady, eyes careful. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there was always something trembling, not weakness, but restraint. He was too wise to let emotion betray him, and she was too afraid to let hers show. So they spoke like strangers, while their hearts screamed like lovers. Her boyfriend, blissfully unaware, would talk about work, about plans, about nothing and everything, and she'd nod, pretending to listen, all the while feeling the doctor's eyes on her, soft, knowing, apologetic. Every time their gazes met, guilt and longing collided in the silence between breaths. It was torture wrapped in tenderness. Nights became her battleground. She'd lie awake replaying moments that shouldn't have meant anything, a shared glance, a kind word, the brush of his hand as he passed her a glass of water. Small things, yet they echoed endlessly inside her mind. She hated herself for it. She hated that love could grow in places it shouldn't, like a flower sprouting through concrete. She tried to convince herself that if she just ignored it long enough, it would fade. But love built on silence is stubborn. It thrives in darkness. The more she tried to bury it, the deeper it rooted itself inside her. And every time she saw him, that quiet ache returned stronger, sharper, impossible to hide. There were moments when she almost confessed, not to her boyfriend, but to the doctor himself. Times when their eyes lingered too long, when the air between them grew too heavy to breathe. Once, after a family dinner, she found herself alone with him in the kitchen. The house was quiet, the world felt suspended. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't stay up so late," he said softly. She smiled weakly, "Neither should you." Their eyes met a long, dangerous pause, and for that heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. But then he looked away. "You need to be careful," he murmured. She didn't know if he meant her health or her heart. Maybe both. And then, as always, he left before the truth could escape between them. The hardest part wasn't the distance, it was the pretense. Pretending she was fine. Pretending she was in love with someone else. Pretending that every family photo wasn't a knife twisting in her conscience. The guilt was relentless. Every time her boyfriend touched her hand, she felt disloyal. Every time his father spoke to her, she felt exposed. She avoided mirrors because even her own reflection looked like a stranger. There were moments when she wanted to run not from either of them, but from herself. Because how do you live with a heart divided between gratitude and guilt? Between the man who saved you and the man who loves you? Between what feels right and what is right? The weight of that secret became her invisible illness, the one no doctor could treat. And yet, beneath the guilt, there was something she couldn't deny. The secret made her feel alive. It terrified her to admit it, but the same feeling that haunted her was also what reminded her she was human. The forbidden nature of it, the quiet thrill, the danger, the depth it awakened something inside her she had long forgotten. Before the accident, before the hospital, before him, she had lived her life half asleep, surviving but not feeling. But now, she felt everything, too much, perhaps, but at least it was real. And in that strange, painful truth, she found both her punishment and her salvation. Every heartbeat carried a secret, and every secret carried him. There comes a moment in every heart's journey when desire and duty collide, when love demands to be heard, yet conscience begs for silence. For her, that moment came quietly, without warning. She didn't plan it, didn't invite it. It arrived like a whisper that grew louder with every passing day. She knew it was wrong. She knew that every glance, every thought, every hidden feeling was a betrayal, not just to her boyfriend, but to the man who had done nothing but save her life and show her kindness. And yet it was precisely that kindness that made it so impossible to resist. The doctor had never once crossed a line, never once encouraged her feelings. His restraint, his decency, his moral strength, they were the very things that drew her in. He had every opportunity to fall, but he didn't. And in that refusal, he became even more unreachable, even more magnetic. She watched him wrestle silently with his own conscience. The small changes didn't escape her, the way his smiles grew more distant, the way he avoided being alone with her, the way his words became carefully measured, every syllable weighed for safety. But there was something else beneath that restraint, something raw and unspoken, like a current running under calm water. He cared, she knew it. He cared deeply, perhaps too deeply, and that was the problem. Love, when buried under morality, doesn't disappear, it transforms into pain, and that pain lived in both of them. Each time their paths crossed, it was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step could destroy everything they held dear. One afternoon, she visited the clinic under the pretense of a checkup. He was startled to see her. The usual calmness in his expression faltered for the briefest second. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, though not unkindly. "I just needed to talk," she replied, her voice trembling. He sighed, setting aside his papers, his eyes searching hers with quiet exhaustion. "You don't need me anymore," he said, trying to sound detached. But she heard the weight beneath the words, the ache of someone trying to convince himself of something he didn't believe. "That's not true," she whispered. "You saved my life." He looked away, "And now I need to save what's left of it." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For the first time, she realized that doing the right thing wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was simply unbearable. In the days that followed, she tried to see him through the lens of logic. She reminded herself of the truth. He was older, wiser, bound by ethics, by family, by the quiet dignity of a man who refused to destroy what he had built. And yet, every attempt to suppress her emotions only deepened their hold on her. Love, once awakened, does not go back to sleep easily. It lurks beneath reason, waiting for the smallest spark to reignite it. And sometimes that spark came in the simplest forms: the sound of his footsteps down the hall, the faint scent of his cologne that lingered in her memory, the echo of his voice reminding her to breathe. Those fragments became her obsession. They were proof that morality could cage the body, but not the heart. He too was not immune. Though he tried to hide it, his eyes betrayed him. He had built his entire life on self-control, on doing what was right, no matter how hard it was. But she tested that foundation without even trying. Her presence was a mirror, reflecting all the choices he wished he could make but never would. One evening, after a family gathering, he found himself alone in the hallway with her. The house was quiet, her boyfriend laughing in another room. For a moment time stood still. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we met differently?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time, too long. "Every day," he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. And then, with visible effort, he stepped back, his hands trembling. "But we didn't," he added. "And that's what makes the difference." His words were simple, but they broke her heart more than rejection ever could. In that moment, she understood what true morality looked like. It wasn't about denying love, it was about choosing what love should protect. He wasn't just protecting his family or his reputation, he was protecting her from judgment, from regret, from herself, and that was the cruelest kindness of all. She realized that sometimes love isn't measured by how tightly you hold on, but by how painfully you let go. The power of morality, she learned, wasn't in its purity, it was in its sacrifice. Because doing the right thing doesn't always feel right. Sometimes it feels like breaking your own heart in slow motion. And yet, that was exactly what he did, and she loved him all the more for it. It happened on a night that felt too quiet to be ordinary. The air carried the weight of something waiting to be said, heavy, fragile, trembling. She had been fighting the feeling for months, pretending, smiling, lying to herself more than anyone else. But lies have a way of echoing louder in silence. That evening, she found herself outside his home, her hands cold, her heart beating far too fast for someone who wasn't supposed to be there. She told herself she would only say thank you, that she needed closure, not confession. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. This wasn't about gratitude. This was about release. About finally exhaling what had been burning inside her chest since the day he saved her life. When he opened the door, surprise flickered across his face, surprise, followed by concern. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, the same words he'd spoken before. But this time her voice didn't tremble. "I know," she whispered, "and yet, here I am." For a moment, neither spoke. The house was dimly lit, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the stillness. He looked at her the way a man looks at a memory he never meant to keep alive. "You're crossing a line," he said finally, his tone firm but pained. "Then stop me," she replied. Her words hung between them, defiant, broken, honest. She wasn't asking for love. She was asking to be understood. "You saved me," she said, her eyes glistening. "Not just my life. You saved the part of me that had already given up. I don't know what to do with that." His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. "You thank me," he said quietly. "You move on. You live." She shook her head. "I've tried. I can't. Every time I look at you, I remember what it felt like to come back from nothing. You didn't just fix my body, you woke something in me I can't silence." He closed his eyes as if her words physically hurt him. "You think I don't feel this?" he said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the calm he always wore like armor. "Do you think this is easy for me?" The emotion in his tone was sharp, real, raw. "Every time I see you, I see everything I cannot have. You remind me of every line I cannot cross, every oath I swore to keep." He took a step closer, not out of desire, but out of helplessness. "You deserve a love that doesn't come with guilt attached. You deserve peace, not this." But peace was the one thing she didn't want, not anymore. "Then what about what you deserve?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Don't you deserve to be happy too?" He looked at her, then really looked, and she saw years of loneliness behind his eyes, years of doing what was right instead of what was wanted. "Happiness," he said with a sad smile, "is a selfish thing when it costs someone else their soul." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I don't want to destroy anything," she whispered. "I just need you to know. I need you to know what you mean to me." Her confession wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was soft, trembling, but pure. The kind of love that doesn't demand, it just exists. She expected him to turn away, to end it, to tell her it was wrong. Instead, he reached out, hesitated, and then brushed a single tear from her cheek with trembling fingers. It was the smallest touch, innocent, fleeting, yet it carried the weight of everything they could never say. "You're too young to understand what this will cost," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No," she replied, "I'm just brave enough to admit it." The room fell into silence again, their breaths the only sound. It wasn't passion that filled the space, it was tragedy dressed in tenderness. He exhaled slowly, as if every breath hurt. "You saved my life too, you know," he said suddenly, his voice breaking. "You reminded me what it feels like to feel again, but that's why I have to stop this." His words were gentle yet final. "If I let this happen, it won't be love anymore, it'll be destruction. And you don't deserve that." His eyes shone with a kind of sorrow. Only good men carry the sorrow of doing the right thing when the right thing hurts the most. She felt her throat tighten. "So what do I do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You live," he whispered again, stepping back, his gaze soft but firm. "And when you do, I'll know I did the right thing." His restraint was both his strength and her undoing. She wanted to scream, to beg him not to walk away, but deep down, she knew he was right. Love wasn't always about being together. Sometimes it was about protecting each other from the consequences of what that love could become. As she turned to leave, she felt the invisible thread between them stretch one last time, fragile, trembling, beautiful, before it finally began to break. The air behind her felt colder, emptier. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she knew one thing with painful clarity. She had told him the truth. Her heart, for the first time in months, was no longer silent. It had spoken, and though the words might ruin her, she would never regret saying them, because love, real love, doesn't fade with distance or denial. It just waits quietly, faithfully for a moment when the world is finally ready to understand it. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but she learned that some don't heal. They simply change shape. Months had passed since that night of her confession. The world had moved on, as it always does, but inside her the echoes still lived. She tried to forget him, tried to bury the memory under the routine of everyday life. But forgetting isn't the same as healing. Every time she passed the hospital, her chest tightened. Every time she saw a man in a white coat, her mind betrayed her. It wasn't that she still loved him in the same way, it was that he had become part of her story, etched deep in a place even time couldn't erase. What she once thought was love, she now realized was transformation. He hadn't just saved her life, he had changed it. And though they could never be together, he had left her with something far greater than possession, understanding. She began to see love differently. It was no longer about who you held or who held you, it was about what that love awakened within you. He had shown her what compassion looked like when it came without condition, what restraint looked like when it came from strength, not fear. His love, though never spoken aloud, had been one of quiet sacrifice, a love that protected rather than pursued. It was the kind of love that doesn't fit into words or rules or relationships. It was the kind of love that leaves you better, not bitter. And that realization changed the way she loved everyone else. She no longer sought intensity or possession. She sought peace, the kind of peace he had carried, even while his heart burned beneath it. There were moments when memories of him would surface, small, gentle reminders. The way he said her name, the way he refused to cross the line, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, as though he wanted to say everything and nothing all at once. And instead of breaking her, those memories began to heal her. They became lessons instead of wounds. She understood now that not every love story needs to end with togetherness. Some loves are meant to arrive, teach, and leave like seasons that bloom and fade, yet never truly disappear. What they shared had been unorthodox, yes, even forbidden, but it was also pure. It had been born not from lust or desire, but from recognition, two souls who saw each other fully and for a fleeting moment understood. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered if he ever thought of her, not with longing but with quiet remembrance. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But she liked to believe that somewhere, when he walked through the hospital halls, he smiled at the thought of her, not because she was forbidden, but because she was living proof of what he had stood for. She had chosen to rise, to grow, to live. And in that way, he had saved her twice, once with medicine and once with love. The difference between the two, she realized, was that the first saved her body, but the second saved her soul. As years passed, she no longer carried guilt. What once felt like a burden had become a quiet gratitude. The world might never understand the complexity of what they shared, but she did. She understood that love doesn't always fit into the labels we create for it: right, wrong, forbidden. Sometimes love simply is. It's the thread that connects hearts across impossible divides, the silent force that teaches us who we are. She had been broken once, fragile, uncertain, drowning in despair. But he had seen her strength before she saw it in herself. And though they couldn't share a life, they shared something far more lasting, a moment of truth that neither could deny. One afternoon, years later, she saw him again by accident, in a quiet cafe. His hair was grayer, his smile still gentle. Their eyes met across the room, and for a heartbeat, time folded. There was no pain, no guilt, only understanding. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in silence long ago. And as he stood to leave, he nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of everything they had endured, everything they had learned. She watched him walk away with a soft smile, realizing that love, in its truest form, doesn't demand ownership or permanence. It simply asks to be felt deeply, honestly, completely, and then released. In the end, she learned that love is not always about having someone. Sometimes it's about becoming someone because of them. He had walked into her life as a healer and left as a lesson that love, in its truest form, is not possession or passion, it is transformation. He taught her that strength isn't in holding on when everything says let go. It's in walking away with grace, even when your heart stays behind. She no longer saw him as the man she couldn't have, but as the soul who reminded her what love could mean: selfless, kind, and brave. Some loves never fade, they simply change form. They turn into prayers whispered to the universe, into memories that warm the coldest nights, into the quiet courage that makes you stand tall again. She would carry him, not as a wound, but as a whisper, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories are not those that end with happily ever after, but those that end with peace, because love, real love, doesn't always stay. Sometimes it saves you and then sets you free.